All right, I have 10:30, so I think we're going to go
Yep.
ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Bob Cochran, the Behavioral Health Training Director for the North Carolina Department of Public Safety, Adult Corrections. I'm pleased you're able to join us today for the sixth webinar in our series on correctional mental health. This one's titled Clinical Writing in Black and White, a Discourse on Documentation in a Gray World, presented by Dr. Marvella Bowman. Today's event, like the others, is being hosted by NCDPS and the Criminal Justice Section of Division 18 of APA. Before we get into today's presentation, I want to go over a few preliminary things. First, you do have to attend today's 90-minute webinar in its entirety if you wish to receive CE credits from APA or for counselors from NVCC. We're not able to provide partial credit. There will be a link posted toward the end of the webinar in the chat box. Please complete that survey and include your information so you can receive a CE certificate, which will be emailed at a later date. I'll also be including a link to Dr. Bowman's slides. She's kind enough to provide that, and I'll put that in the chat box as well. Now, during the presentation, if you have questions, go ahead and put those in the Q&A section, and I'm going to read those to Dr. Bowman at the end of the presentation. Hopefully, we can get to all your questions. But now, what we're here for today, I'd like to introduce Dr. Marvella Bowman. Dr. Bowman is the Program Manager for Mental Health Services at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women in Raleigh, North Carolina. She's worked in the North Carolina prison system for several years, providing supervision to mental health professionals and therapeutic intervention and assessment to the incarcerated offender population. Outside of the prison setting, she also provides consultation and assessment to those seeking assistance in the community, as well as workshops and presentations on a variety of topics related to behavioral health and well-being. So thank you, Dr. Bowman, for taking the time today to share your expertise on this subject. It is very greatly appreciated. I'm now going to turn it over to you, and I will return during the Q&A section.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cochran, and hello to those of you who are joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and get started talking about clinical writing. May not be one of our favorite topics, but if you're a mental health professional, it's something that we must do. So it's important that we have this discussion. And I will say that I do want this to be eventually a discussion later on. I'll present some information. There's a ton of information that is probably debatable and worth further conversation. So I welcome that later on. But I'll just go ahead and kind of put out the disclaimers to begin with, just basically letting everyone know I'm not receiving any financial benefit from any manufacturer of any of the resources that I'm discussing or sharing. There's no commercial support for this activity. There are limitations to the information that I will present. I can't guarantee that everything that I'm saying will be accurate and the utility will be exactly right for you. Different fields and different areas and different locations may benefit more or less from the information shared today. And there's no serious risk expected if you use any of these strategies or any of the resources provided. I'm trying to move forward my slides, so I apologize for the delay. So what are our objectives for today? What we want to do is make sure that we identify and explain the reasons for including specific types of information in our clinical documentation. I want to go over some best practices that we can utilize to successfully complete our documentation, and then distinguish between what's required, what's personal preference, and what is completely erroneous in our documentation. And so I'll just kind of give this slide is just up because when I think about approaching writing, I've always come from this type of framework, probably something we were educated about in elementary or junior high school. And to give you a background on myself, I have been working in the field of mental health and psychology for some time in various roles. But before I got into mental health, I had different dreams, right? So all of us who've had different career goals later on when we were younger, right? And that changes over time. But when I was very young, I wanted to be a fiction writer. So I was interested in writing. I took very seriously my classes in English and had some interest in journalism over the years and things of that nature. And so this is one of those primary ways that we have been taught to kind of think about information that we provide and information that we receive. So we want to think about the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, and the how. Now, like I said, coming up, I wanted to do things like being an author. That changed to wanting to be a lawyer. That changed and switched over to wanting to just do some different things. I had a time where I wanted to be a tenure track professor. The constant in all of those would require a great deal of writing. So I did maintain focus on English. And again, this popped back up in later years when I studied English in college along with psychology. So just to kind of go into more detail about what the 5 W's and H entail. Some very important questions that we all need to think about when we are completing our documentation. Who are you writing to and who are you writing about? So there's the audience, referring parties, things of that nature. And then there's the subject or the client. What are we saying? Who are we talking to? Then what are we writing? What exactly are we completing the document for, right? So is it a progress note? Is it an assessment report? Where might we be completing this documentation? And not only where are we completing the documentation, but where are we storing our documents? The importance of location is something that we'll be discussing today. And then when are you writing these notes? The immediacy, the timing of when we're completing our documentation, whether I said notes, but it could be a report, it could be any other type of documentation required of you. Then why are you writing this? This might seem like a more existential question than anything else, but it is an important thought to have and thinking about the purpose of what we're doing. And then how we're writing. So the technicality of it all. Are we taking physical handwritten notes? Are we documenting by typing stuff out on our computers or laptops, or are we using a tablet? Are we doing dictation? And then also, how are we writing in terms of our tone and our style of writing? So these are kind of how we'll frame today's discussion. And so starting with considering who, our target audience and the subject. Focusing on the target audience, we definitely have to consider who we are speaking to. This is going to inform the content of the information provided, the language that we might use, and the tone of the documentation altogether. When we consider the subject, we want to be able to describe in the documents themselves the subject, who they are, and the purpose of the encounter. And these things might include demographic information, their presentation, their mental status, which I'll go more into when we talk about what. So some points to ponder, and I'm quoting from some authors who've written about documentation. The reference list is at the end, and I just found these books to be helpful in kind of shaping thought process about writing. So some things to think about: we don't want to do any harm. We're helping the client by providing appropriate documentation. We always want to keep in mind that the client may read their file, so we don't want anything in that file to be harmful or hurtful for them to read. And I'll put a little caveat with that, pin in that to come back to. And we want to focus the narrative on the needs of whoever will be reading it. So the reader might be the referrer, a supervisor, the client's next therapist, the courts, a lawyer, medical care provider. Many other people might be requesting or seeing this note, one of the above, or maybe possibly all of them. But noting that when we're writing, each person is going to understand what we're saying from their own perspective. So keep that in mind as we're writing. That should inform some of the content of what we put in our documentation as well. So thinking about what we're writing. So the content of our documents will be based largely on the type of encounter that we may be having, right? So this might be an intake, first time meeting with a client, might be a mental health assessment for those of us who are in the Department of Prison. Some of the terminology I use will be specific to us, may not mean the same thing in other environments. But if you just think about the different types of encounters that you might have, the initial one, what you put in the initial encounter documentation is going to probably differ a great deal from a progress note, an ongoing progress note that you might be having on a repetitious basis, weekly, monthly, however frequently you meet with the client. And then psychological testing, the content of those are vastly different from what you might put in a therapy note, correct? So the content of what we do is going to be based on what we are writing. However, I think that all of these, any encounters that we're doing should include, and this is for each of them, any kind that you can think of should include some measure of this. The purpose, the date, the time, it's a good idea to include the length of the encounter, some specifics about the mental status. We definitely want to assess for risk, particularly for suicide and self-injury, violence risk. Those of us who work in the prisons, we need to talk about escape risk to the level that we can address it. And then we also want to include disposition and/or recommendations. Now, I said all, and in general, every time I speak, these kind of absolutes are not always going to be accurate, right? So I did put down discussion regarding the limits of confidentiality consent. I wouldn't expect that every therapy session that you're necessarily going to go over that, right? But your initial assessment or an intake, your initial testing session, if you're doing psychological testing, and it might go on over a course of days. Certain things, there are certain times that you want to address, at least in one encounter, that you went over the information about limits of confidentiality and consent. In the prison system, sometimes, very often actually, confidentiality agreements are signed well before the therapist may meet with the individual, and who knows if anybody had a good conversation with the client about what that actually means. So taking some time to do that in the session and documenting that you did that is really important and recommended. Now, as far as mental status, a lot of people do this in many different ways, and I will gladly admit that much of what I'm saying, I have to check myself. And if you look back at some of my notes, some of you have access to reading my notes. I haven't done all of this, but in researching not only for this presentation, but as I've gone on and seen other people's report writing and methods and what they address, I've shaped and changed over the years to include information that I thought was pertinent. And I think that's something that we all do as we grow and learn in the field. So the mental status exam might be a more formalized checklist that you utilize, like the example I provide here from therapistaid.com. Great website for various resources. But if you do not have kind of a method of going through the mental status, it's good to have one. It doesn't have to be this, but it's good to have something that you kind of check off all those areas, or you're discussing all of the areas that need to be addressed. Now, this information it should be gathered throughout the entirety of the encounter. I think sometimes we kind of want to get through our little checklist, observing and checking on what the person is presenting, but after that, we might not think about it again. But throughout the entire encounter, we're kind of checking to see how's the person behaving, did their motor activity change, did their level of eye contact change, and addressing those things as needed. And so I just have a list here that's explaining what the mental status includes, and you can definitely look through that. I won't go through each, but make sure that we are including some discussion of their mental status in our encounters. And I apologize, advancing my slides is a little more laborious than I thought it would be. All right. So now for an intake or psychological assessment, for those of us who are in prisons or adult correction in North Carolina, we have a mental health assessment is what the document itself is called. And I know I've seen over the years a wide variety of the depth of information that's included in these. I've had discussions even with Dr. Cochran about kind of what do we include in certain documentation, and it's going to pop back to those what slides. Who are we writing this for? Who is it going to inform? And what's the purpose of the documentation is going to, really speak to that. So these are the things that I tend to want to put in all of my reports? Do they get in all of them? Do they get in all of my assessments? If you go pull one up right now, you're probably not going to see all of these addressed. But I think these are important topics to include, especially in those initial assessments where we're trying to gather as much information as we can about our client, the person that we're working with. If we're doing a test or we're tasked to do a specific type of report, this information is pretty much kind of the baseline of what I think is necessary and what I've found to be important. And again, over the years have shaped and changed this. So the name, for many of us, some of that's kind of automatic because of how we document it in our system. We do have a specific type of electronic documentation that automatically inserts the person's name and other information. Age, I tend to want to kind of get that specifically. It's important, I would say, especially for those of us working in prisons, to ask as well as check records, because there have been discrepancies. It's as simple as a typo on somebody's part during their processing into the institution. And in any other field, if you might be getting documents from somewhere else and you see here record review is included, make sure you're asking about this information and documenting if there's any discrepancy. If the person that you're working with is saying, oh, this is wrong in the system, my birth date is actually this, and I'm this many years of age, but the system says something different, we want to have that documented. So date and place of birth, where they were reared, these things tend to have a lot of influence, or can have a lot of influence on what other factors that might be going on in your work with them. So it's a good idea to get an assessment of that. Identity variables, as we know, many of these topics are becoming more and more important in our work. So I would suggest, and I have been encouraging staff that works with me to ask these questions explicitly out of the gate. So we have things like gender, sexuality, race, and ethnicity, religious beliefs. All of these things can help, especially if you're going to be doing your work with them. Even just asking these questions can kind of break down some barriers and cause some relief in the individual, even though initially they might be like, wow, you're asking a lot of questions, but it's really helpful to the ongoing work. Record review. We definitely want to do thorough record review if we can. I will admittedly state, in the prison system, there might be, depending on how long the person has been in our system, you may have a far ways to go back and a lot of different things to review. And time may not be on our side, or think that's something that we don't have a ton of. But when we can, it's a great idea to go back and look at all the prior records, all the prior diagnoses, all of those things. Legal and criminal history is important, marital status, family history, trauma and abuse history. I tend to distinguish between childhood and adolescent abuse versus partner violence, and specifically asking about that. Education level, occupation, employment status, socioeconomic status. I often ask, especially in the prison population, what was the longest time you worked at any one place? I think that's a really good indicator of some other things. Substance use history, medical concerns, any mental health history that we can find, also gather from the individual. And if we can pull records from any place else, that's also helpful, I've found. Get a sense of the ADLs, their cognitive functioning. Might need to ask for some collateral information or for somebody else to complete some documentation for us to get more information about that. We definitely want to include the presenting problem or referral question, or why the person is coming in for treatment. And then if we do any formal or standardized assessment measures, include what those are. Be careful not to include the entire measure itself. We don't need specific questions from any assessment measure or anything like that. But we do want to say that, okay, I utilize the MMPI to assess for personality functioning, whatever that may be. And then any clinical observations and impressions, and then your diagnostic picture, which if you've worked in the prison system, and there's a wide variety of diagnoses that you'll see folks come in with. Now, as far as specifically progress notes, again, in our system, we have a specific mental health progress note that kind of breaks down things for us, and there's certain things that we have to include before we move on. But there is some wiggle room, right? So many of us have heard about the SOAP method. I've already stated, and I've probably put it in a number of slides because I cannot emphasize enough how much and how important assessment of risk for suicide and self-injury and violence, and in the case of in the prisons, escape. but we need to include those, and it's a good idea to include those even if you're not working in the prison system, because you want to kind of make sure that you're addressing those concerns. That's important before having folks leave, that you're having that conversation about their wellness and their safety and the safety of others that they may be around. But going back to the type of information that we put in our progress notes, many of us have heard of that SOAP approach, right? So you have the subjective information that you get more from the client, then you have the observable or the objective, things that you can observe, that you can verify, that you can kind of quantify yourself. And then the assessment piece. So again, there's a nice 9-item checklist from Weiger that you can utilize just to kind of pull together what's happening as a result of that contact. And then you want to talk about the plan. What's going to happen? What are you going to do to address the concerns that have come up? And then DAP or DAP is just consolidating subjective and objective. So again, for those of us in the prison system, we kind of have things laid out for us in the way that our documentation is laid out, but somebody might be here who's in the community and putting together how they're going to manage their progress notes and manage their documentation. Using these kind of already laid out strategies are a good practice and helpful for you and protective for you as well. And I always say we want to be able to talk about measurable progress. I'll probably talk about that a little bit more, but we want to have things that we can say have some type of quantifiability. It may not always be accurate or particularly useful, but it's a good idea to have it documented so that we can have that support as needed in what we are putting in our paperwork. So treatment goals specifically, I've always recommended that we, number one, discuss these with the client. I think sometimes, especially in the prison system, we might just have some automatic, remain infraction free, take your medication, whatever it might be. And those are definitely very easy to quantify. But having that conversation with the client and letting them know what you're putting in the document. I've more recently been saying, hey, there are some things that I tend to have to put in my documentation because it needs to meet, check off all this criteria, but what are your goals? What are your specific goals? It may not be something that we're going to put into the treatment plan specifically, but we're going to, when the person sends that back to me or talks to me about it, yeah, that's going to be in the documentation. This person wants to work towards, just having a better relationship with their mom or whatever the case may be. It might not be the specific goals that we need to work on towards reducing, their or understanding their disorder for perhaps, but it's something that they want to work on personally. And that's something we're going to describe and discuss and document about. So again, identify specific goals, quantify those goals and monitor progress, make goals realistic and manageable. So again, going back to the prison system, if I put 0, remain infraction free for a calendar year, and the person tends to have 10 infractions a month, that's probably not a realistic and manageable goal. We can make that, we can make that a little bit more realistic, right? Or maybe that's not going to be a goal at all, but just an example. So our goals should be, the goals that we formulate with the client should be important to them and reflective of their values. So we do want to kind of get some buy-in to that. And, if there is something that's really from another party, such as, I'm sticking with remaining infraction free because that tends to be important in our system, right? Lining that up with something else that they're trying to do. So they might be talking about their ability to have self-control or things like that. Marry those and create some type of goal that's going to be measurable over time that you can discuss with them. And then when it comes time to kind of reassess the individual, you can say, here's the progress, or we haven't made progress. Why is that? And so select a time frame to achieve whatever goals are identified. And I think very often we kind of default to when we have a treatment review, but you can say monthly. Each time we meet, we're going to discuss how you did this past month on not engaging in any self-injury, for example, whatever it is. So some things to think about from the authors that I referenced in this presentation. So there are times when it's important to document in detail what has transpired during a session. But on the other hand, documenting everything that takes place may violate the client's confidentiality in areas that are not necessary to document, whereas under-documenting may fail to document that specific services are taking place. And this picture, when you get the slides, if you so desire, there's this picture is actually takes you to a link to a New York Post article about the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial. I haven't been following it, but there are some, in this case, she is stating that she has been abused, and some of her therapy sessions prove that abuse. And so you see a picture of some redacted notes there. So this is a good commonplace example of how much are we putting in our notes, how much detail are we putting in our notes, and what can that information be used for. Now, as far as report writing, Zuckerman says the report should be the shortest way to convey the essential information. So balance, brevity, and thoroughness. So here's where we go into that kind of how much do we do, how much don't we do, may be debatable, but I think if we do our best to include what's necessary and what's useful in making the progress and answering the questions that are asked, then we are in good shape. Now, where is the documentation occurring? So I tend to include, especially as those of us who work in prison, the location of the contact. I tend to put that, especially when there's a difference between an office setting and possibly on a dorm or in a housing location at the door of a cell. There's probably going to be different content of the note based on the location because of confidentiality and things of that nature. Specifying that can kind of clue people in who are reading it, who are probably going to be your colleagues, right? As to how much in depth the session was. This can also go back to when I talked about including the length of session, so we can kind of have a sense of what's been going on over time. 5 minutes at a cell door is vastly different from an hour in an office. So these things can be helpful in informing what's been going on with the client. So including the location of the contact, and for those of us who might work in multiple settings and our documents may need to include, kind of keeping track of where were we? Was I working in the office today versus in the community, and those kind of things. So again, I suggest specifying where the encounter occurred, and note that conditions in the location could impact the client's behaviors, their responses, their functioning. Again, if I'm at a cell door, if I'm at a holding cell area where there are a bunch of other people around and it's melee and it's a bunch of confusion, it's probably not going to be, number one, a great session. So whether or not we call that a full session, that's another debate. But if you're getting the pertinent information that you need, there's that, but then we also put caveats. There were others around. They might not have been being fully honest about their answers. So we might want to circle back till we have time to have a more private contact. So that's really specifying the location of the contact itself, which can influence every other factor that we've been talking about. And then where we're doing our documentation. And so not just for those of us in the prison setting per se, but where you might have to be doing your documentation as someone working in a hospital setting or in private practice. It might be more of a cubicle setting than an office. And so are you taking measures to keep information private, such as like a screen, a shield, so that folks can't just walk by and see what you're writing? If you do written documentation, where is that located? Where is it kept? Where is it stored and housed? We want to keep any of our records that we have, whether they're handwritten or computer-based, want to keep that secure. We're going to abide by any HIPAA standards or other policies regarding patient health information that applies to our field. Everybody might not be in the US, so if there's somewhere else that you may be working, if there's other standards, want to be familiar with those and follow those accordingly. So some things to think about. I know I kind of just brushed on it, but Baldwin states that the integrity of our work rests upon it being conducted in a confidential and private setting. And we want to be sure to inform ourselves and follow the specific regulations regarding record storage stipulated by your particular profession, the professional order, and your clinical setting and jurisdiction. So definitely keep that in mind. Now, when are we documenting things? This, again, might be something that is up for debate. There's a number of things that can impact when we're able to complete our documentation, including not only just personal preference, but just availability of materials and timing and different things. So I always say definitely the prison system as immediately as possible, as close to the time of the contact that occurs, get that documentation completed, saved, done, right? Um, there's many reasons for that. In the prison system, in our system in particular, people may transfer to other locations immediately. People can be released without a ton of notice. So if you're taking weeks at a time to complete notes, then the person might be gone. You may not be able to actually complete it because they're no longer physically in the building, and thus you cannot update the electronic record in that way. Now, we've had workarounds. We've had folks who've transferred without, I saw you today, the person transferred tomorrow, didn't get to complete the note. So you contact the clinician or the program manager over there and kind of share information so that they can complete the document. Hopefully it's not completely devoid of information. But this is why I will tend to tell people kind of create a way to get as much as you can into the document and complete it as soon as possible. And that also impacts, like, what are you going to recall from the note? If you didn't take some people take handwritten notes and then transfer those, and that's fine as well. But there's some, there are definitely concerns with that. If you say lose or drop or accidentally shred that paperwork, you might just be going based off of memory. And then how much did you remember? Are there specifics or details that you can't 100% say that that's what they said or that's what happened? After seeing multiple people throughout a day, things can get muddled, right? So it improves our recall when we document immediately after the contact, or if you're like me, kind of during. We'll talk about that. The accuracy of the information that we're including is impacted by how rapidly we're completing those notes. And then if we have access to the information in our own brains, and then can we access their chart if they're no longer in the facility. So there's an article that you guys can check out when you get the slides from Psychology Today, and it's just asking that general question: why do some therapists take notes in session? Of course, again, that's one of those things that may be up for debate and discussion, and balancing the need for accurate documentation with building rapport and interacting well with the client. And that part is really up to you, but I think it's something to think about in terms of how easily you might be able to, you can do both. You can get the best of both worlds and kind of create a routine with those you're working with. I know people on my caseload know that I'm going to kind of get through some questions with them, and we're going to answer specific things. And then I'm going to turn to you, and we're going to have that more what would be traditionally thought of as therapeutic encounter versus kind of like me just information gathering. So like I said, tons of things in this presentation will be debatable. And like I said, we can do it later, right? Have that conversation in a little bit. So some things to think about. Now, in terms of when I was looking at some of these resources and the books that I had, nobody really discussed the timing of documentation. I don't know if that's due to the assumption that you do it right away, or just that it's not something that's really come up, or nobody wants to kind of put on paper what it should be because there's such a vast difference in what might be available or appropriate. So for example, if you're doing testing or an assessment, and it might just take some more time to get all that information gathered and completed than someone who might be doing therapy and that's all they do, and it's just constantly putting in that documentation right away, not requiring a ton of other activities. So it would be hard to say, but I think the best rule of thumb that I would suggest is the sooner the better. I think it's a wise use of your time to get that portion of your day completed on a professional level as well as on a personal and individual level. You don't want those things kind of hanging over your head, causing anxiety. Oh, I got to get back and do this. And so your mind is elsewhere when it should be maybe at home or doing your leisure activities. You want to be available to do and devote your time fully to the other tasks that you might have. So, if I met with this person at 9 a.m., there's probably something else I need to do at 2 p.m. I don't want to be worrying about writing those 9 a.m. notes at 2 p.m. when I know I have other things that need to be done. And then there may be some ethical concerns or questions about completing the documentation days after the encounter. Things like, are you recalling the information correctly? Where's that information that you jotted down being held? Do you have it in a Word document somewhere? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But just kind of where are all these things being stored? Is that appropriate? Is it ethically stored? And as you're trying to get it into the official record, is that lapse in time, there can be some concerns and some issues that come up. So, like I said, my suggestion overall would be the sooner the better. Now, why? So I guess this is the more existential piece of the presentation. But when we're really thinking about why we're documenting, if we have a clear understanding of the reasons that we're completing the encounter and the corresponding paperwork, that will facilitate the right type of documentation, right? And the unfortunate thing, and I think that goes for all of this, is that many of us are like, kind of really running, right? We're trying to do a whole lot of stuff in a short amount of time. And sometimes we can't, or we fail to take a step back and kind of think of, okay, why am I documenting this right now? Like, what is the purpose of this encounter, and what do I need to put here? Why am I doing this? So overall, I really think, and I broke it down to someone like this the other day, for the most part, our work involves gathering information and meeting needs. And those needs might be that of the client, it might be that of a referring party, it might be that of a court or wherever. But if we kind of break it down to that baseline, then we can really look at sensibly, what do I need to put in this document? Why am I saying this? Why am I including this? How is that helping? How is that informing the folks who need this information? And so I know many times I tend to think of, in terms of, especially with my therapeutic work, somebody else is probably going to have this client after me. Somebody else is probably going to be trying to figure out, how far did I go doing this, or that? What kind of work did we do? What were we talking about? And so I don't need to include every single detail, which some of you who may have read my notes may have noticed I did that at one point in time. That was kind of how I documented, and that was not a great idea. But we want to be clear that, we want to give enough information that somebody else can kind of pick up where we leave off and know how far our client has gone before they move on to the next individual. So some things to consider. What is the nature of the problem faced by the client or the person who referred the client? Who referred them? When did they refer them? What was the services that they were requesting? What was the purpose? The greater the precision of this goal, the easier the report is to write. And I think any other type of documentation is to write, because you'll always be returning to those questions. Spend as much time as necessary to refine your understanding of the referrer's needs. So the Zuckerman text is more focused on report writing than it is therapeutic notes, but I think those questions are good for any type of documentation. We want to document our clinical work and try to do so in a manner that's as protective of the patient's privacy and confidentiality as possible. And the reason I say that, again, kind of going back to, sometimes we may just be completing too much. Again, this is kind of, you can couch this under a different topic area as well, but I think I definitely want to hit this point, especially working in the prison system, right? We may be completing, right, our therapy document if we're focusing on the goals of reducing suicidal behaviors and depressive symptoms. Is it necessarily appropriate or adequate or necessary to include information about, they start talking about their criminal activity and you notice that's not what they're in the prison system for? Do I need to put all of that down? And really, to me, the answer would be no in that case. And then there are issues of duty to warn and things of that nature, and we have to parcel those out. But again, if we know that we're focusing on the information that's geared towards outcomes that we're looking for, treatment goals, if we're answering specific referral questions in report writing, these are times when we, again, have those conversations with the offender about confidentiality and the limits thereof, and kind of point them in the direction of understanding why you guys are there. And this is also important, if we have a clear picture of this, that we're sharing that with the client, because how many of us have those that come in and kind of just dump everything on us, and that's not really the point of therapy necessarily, or the point of whatever the encounter might be. You might be doing a specific type of evaluation, and the person just feels like, oh, well, this is the therapist or this is the doctor, so I'm just going to tell them everything that's happening everywhere, and I'm complaining about the food and I'm complaining about this. Not that those things are not important, but we don't necessarily need to take up the time in that way. So if we're understanding why we're having these encounters, we can also shape the encounters, and then that will help us shape what we're documenting and how we're documenting. And my apologies, I'm a fast talker, so I'm trying to slow myself down. So factors influencing a report's format will include its purpose or the referral question, the writer's theoretical orientation, the intended audience, and our own personal writing styles. Weiger suggests providing adequate details pertaining to the referral and summarizing other areas. So again, if we are just being asked to determine what's this person's cognitive functioning, then we're not necessarily going to write about everything else going on in their lives that they might disclose in a session or that encounter. Okay, so the how. So how are we doing our documentation? Specific technical practices. So how you document is likely to shape what you document. So if you're writing by hand, well, and this might differ for different people, but I know if I was forced, and there were times in my career where I did have to do handwritten notes, they were probably not as detailed as my typewritten notes. There was a lot more checklists and different things like that that would be utilized. But you know, your handwritten notes may not be as long, or if you're a fast writer, it may be longer than typewritten notes. If you have to do dictation, that probably pares down how you document as well. I had a position at one point that we didn't have access to a computer, and we had to dictate. We took down on paper and then we dictated, and there were individuals that printed it out. We had to then correct it and give it back to that individual to process. So, you know, keeping in mind there's multiple documents, so whatever checklist and scratch paper that I'm using to fill this stuff out, then using that to get on the dictation line and then getting that from another. So there's a lot of moving parts. And we have to consider in those instances what remains a part of the official record, and then what's considered just our process notes or what we're utilizing to gather the information. There may be rules that are specific to where you work about how to keep those official records, of course, and then the process information. That would also go for example, things like a record of a specific testing record, or the record booklet, for example, in the WAIS. If you have that actual booklet, what do you do with that? But how are all those things being dealt with? But in terms of how we're documenting, we want to kind of look at what we're doing, and we know that that shapes what will happen as a result, right? So techniques that we use, I think it's important for everybody to develop their own style. Not only does that assist with, I think we all have one, whether or not we've thought about it or developed it formally. But in thinking about how we write, I think it's smart to kind of get a sense of how you're doing this in a way that can facilitate it being done more rapidly in the future, being done more easily, a way that can be easily trained to others if it's useful and beneficial, if others have found it helpful. And again, this is something that changes over time, that can change. It should grow and change as we grow and change. So in terms of style, again, returning back to language and tone, there'll be a little bit more on that. Structure and organization, like we talked about before. I do encourage folks to use checklists or pre-populated sentence strings. Those of us who work with the electronic record, there's options for including sentence strings and things that you can kind of just click on. And it's a reminder. For me, I've always utilized it as a reminder. Here are the things that I definitely want to ask about and look for. There's pros and cons to that. I have definitely made the error, and we'll talk about this later on as far as proofreading, but put in a sentence string and didn't complete the sentence. I need to go back and complete the sentence. The other thing about when we have these kind of techniques and what I would call maybe hacks for kind of getting things done quickly, we still have to have backup options. So maybe paper documents that you can use. The particular facility that I work at, on Monday, the power went down 5 or 6 times during that day. If I did not have some type of method, I happened to not be in session. And I think most people just kind of ended those encounters because we were in complete darkness. But even when the lights came back on, the computers didn't come right back up. So if I'm completely reliant on my set sentence strings and my electronic record, and I'm sitting in an encounter, do I have something that I can maybe pull from and say, okay, here's how I complete this? We have specific evaluations, for example, for self-injury risk if somebody presents in crisis. And so there are paper versions of that for the express purpose of times when everything goes down. There's nothing wrong with creating your own version of, your therapy encounters, or things that you want to remember to ask about and do. And then also, just having ways to keep those records until you can get them into the formal or more official record. So again, some things to think about, and this will go to like language and tone. Documentation should be neutral or value-free. This is something that we may need to think about in terms of our own health and wellness in times of completing the type of work that we may be doing. So I think anybody who works in the mental health field, we have major stressors. We're hearing a lot of information that may not be pleasant. We're having to deal with that in some meaningful way. And sometimes we get tired, or we get annoyed, or we get, that should not be reflected in our documentation. So definitely consider and go back and listen. There's some sessions where I've typed out, and because I know how I felt about that interaction, I just saved it. And that's one where it wasn't completed immediately. I have to go back and check it later, and delete that. I don't need to say that. Check ourselves in that way. Or if you feel like, okay, I don't have the capacity to check myself, I think it's important that we help one another out and support each other. So it might be worthwhile to have somebody review some notes for you, especially with certain clients that you may not work well with or not enjoy being around so much, right? Or maybe some that you have a bias towards, like, this person's great, they're awesome, they do such great work in therapy, and that's your feeling, but how are we communicating that, and what's being communicated in the document? Should be neutral and value-free for the most part. When reporting on what the client has told you, try to maintain an observational or journalistic style. Again, some of the stuff that we can discuss, but we definitely, this is not, as I talked about, I wanted to be a fiction author. I'm not writing fiction books. I am currently documenting a professional encounter. So that's how it should read. Now, whether or not there's some narrative portions of it and things like that, that can be helpful because it supports what you're saying. So if you're saying that the person denied any suicidal behaviors, having a direct quote, "Oh, I love myself, I would never do that," that's helpful in providing support. So it's fine to have some of that narrative style, but including, our overall kind of approach should be more observational or journalistic. An important reason that these process notes, again, the little scratch paper that you may take down, little checklists that you might use to make sure that you remember everything, these should be excluded from the official record, right? So there might be a temptation to, if you recall a couple slides back, I showed a mental status exam that was a checklist from Therapist Aid website. A real simple thought might be, I can just scan this in to the official record, and that would be great. No, not necessarily. So know what your requirements are. In our facilities in North Carolina, we are cautioned against including documentation that's not on any official DC forms. So, we do need to kind of move over the information in a way that might take longer, but just keep in mind that we want to keep separate official record from kind of our process notes, our process of information and material. And the important reason that these tend to be excluded is that they could reveal some information that, when taken out of context or without the requisite professional understanding, may be hurtful or even damaging to the well-being of the client, such as when read by the client himself or herself or by a third party who may gain access to the clinical record. And then, just as kind of an additional side note, is the concept of like how we're doing things in terms of our access to computers and technology and how this has advanced over the years. Having computer generated, for example, treatment plans, that's become an effective and time-saving resource to clinicians. So that might be more prominent for those who don't work in a system like ours. But if you have a bank for yourself, or if you're looking at, I have the advantage of having to read a number of people's notes and kind of seeing, oh, that's a neat way to put that. That's a smart way to kind of address or create initial treatment goals before we develop the therapeutic rapport that might make it a more specific or things of that nature. So having a bank of goals that we commonly use, that's something that we can do at every location, and possibly we can do it across the state. Something we might be able to do, but that can be, very time saving. Not sure that would be computer generated, it would be generated by us, but just kind of having that available could be useful. So overall, some do's and don'ts, right? And again, I will point to myself as saying that there have been times, probably more frequently than I'd like to admit, that I'm not doing these things that I should be doing, and that I'm kind of doing some other things that are in the don'ts list, right? So proofreading carefully. And some people might be like, oh, who has the time to do that? I know of folks who kind of type their note first in Word, look it over, do what they need to do, and then move it over to the electronic record. Whatever works for you. Like I said before, maybe saving the document and getting back to it a little bit later, if, appropriately. So not just kind of passing it off, but okay, you might need to get through certain portions of other things going on and then have some time to sit and look through before you hit enter or complete note or whatever might be the strategy for your documentation. So do proofread carefully. Quote the client when possible, when appropriate, when you can remember the quote. So if you're not writing in real time or typing in real time, you'd probably be less likely to actually recall the quote. And I don't think I have this. I'll go through the do's and then kind of say what I'm thinking afterwards. But do quote the client. I think it's a very helpful way to kind of provide support for what we might be concluding or saying. Include qualifiers and caveats or limitations. So, I prefer, to say things like, it seems that this is what's happening, because I can't definitively say what's happening in this person's head other than what they're saying. So like if they say this, I can quote it. But if something about their body language seemed to betray that, I need to document that, but I can't say that that's what it was. So, their physical discomfort appeared to reflect anxiety, and later I might address it and be like, oh no, I just have gas. Like so, it's important to kind of include qualifiers, because we don't always know why whatever's happening in the moment is happening in that way, right? And so that leads into the next do, to clearly distinguish between your interpretation and the observation. So again, using that example, I observed them moving awkwardly in their seat, appearing to be in discomfort. And I might interpret that as anxiety about the topics that we're discussing. If I don't address it in that moment, might address it the next encounter, and they say that they were physically in pain because, they had been doing laundry and they had a backache. Okay, I wasn't correct, but I made an observation and an interpretation based off of the information I had. So don't rush, which, yeah, some of us, that seems to be, or feels like it might be our lives, right? And the amount of work that we feel as if we have to do in rapid succession. But try not to rush, particularly with the sessions themselves and with your documentation. Take some time, look through some things before hitting send or complete or whatever it is. Don't provide information that was not gathered. So I think what can feel like a responsibility to make sure that we fill in every area. So again, speaking for those of us working in the prison system, we have the way that our electronic documents are set up. There are like drop downs and things that we have to complete before we move forward. However, if we don't gather information about it, don't make it seem that we did, right? So there's the escape drop down. If we don't discuss it, thankfully the official drop down or whatever's in there is like there's no evidence of it, which is a little safer than saying the client denied. Don't write client denied if you didn't have a discussion and the client didn't deny it, right? So we don't want to provide information that we did not gather. Don't make definitive statements that can't be supported by anything that was provided in the actual encounter. This can happen a lot if we think about our perceptions or our feelings based off, and it could be based off of a ton of knowledge and experience, but if we can't support it, particularly in that document or any supporting documents, that could be an unsafe practice, right? So we might feel as if an offender is malingering, right? If I don't do any further testing, I'm not going to write a document offender is malingering, right? If I didn't do any type of assessments to support that, that'd be a very difficult statement to back up in a court setting, right? Might be more appropriate to say, you know, this is not consistent with presentation, or just different things to kind of make the same point, but not make definitive statements that we can't support with what we're saying. And this was mentioned earlier, but don't over-report. So putting every single thing that the person says and kind of writing in a stream of consciousness fashion. I've done it before. Don't under-document. So just kind of writing the absolute bare minimum that's not really helpful other than to indicate that we actually saw the person. So kind of the example that I would give for that, I can absolutely use myself in the over-documenting portion. There have been times where I've really just written everything the person told me in that session because I wanted to have it on file. Good, bad, or indifferent, what that could mean in the future, who knows? But I do recall doing that. Speaking towards how I was feeling at that time, I was, number one, very tired, and number two, very much feeling as if I'm not going to be able to recall this information if I don't put it down in this way. Now, that might be a time where it's more appropriate to kind of write for yourself and keep it in a separate place that is locked and secure, but something that you can refer to at another time. Then under documentation, I think we've all been there where we've had to complete a very rapid note. We might have had a very brief encounter, doesn't have a ton of information, but still we want to make sure that we include everything that needs to be included. So if it is brief, cool. But if you spent 45 minutes with an offender, and I think this is kind of the other thing that I tend to look at, if all of your notes look exactly the same in terms of content. So I'm talking about some of those shortcuts and hacks that I think are great. If we use that in a way where we're not including enough information, so we're under documenting, we're not putting enough, we're not really talking about what's specifically happening with this offender. Awesome that we have an MSE there, but I have no idea what you're doing in session. I can read 4 and 5 notes over, back to back, and I have no idea what happened in each of your sessions. Like there was nothing specific to that client that looks any different from any of your other clients. That can be a problem. So make sure you're doing something or including something that's specific to that person, even if it's just as simple as discussing a specific type of topic, not that you're necessarily going to put all the details, but what is it specific to this person that you're working on, and how is that being done? Are there specific techniques pulled from specific types of therapy that you are doing? If you're, again, assessments, hopefully we are including specifically what measures we're using. So just not putting too little or too much. Overall point there. And this actually comes from the world of pharmacy, which is not really what we do. So all of this will not apply, but I just thought this was really interesting. And there's a link. Those of you who grab the slides, you can go to the actual website this comes from, and it will look better than this, brighter and easier to see. But just kind of to think about what they're saying the do's and don'ts are for their pharmaceutical work, right? So do record the data as soon as it's generated, take ownership of what you recorded, add notes to provide context, validate your system. That doesn't really necessarily apply to us, except maybe it does in terms of, I'd love to, when we can update some of the things that we utilize on a regular basis. Limit document access to authorized personnel. So again, that talks about the safety of our records and who gets to see them. Who has access to our office space. I admittedly have things all over my desk. If somebody else gets in there, what do they have access to? Do they have access to process notes and other personalized health information, patient health information? Send data for review or verification, so that the earlier discussion about possibly having somebody else look over some of your notes, maybe having a discussion with your supervisor, tagging them on some documentation so they can review. I think most supervisors just automatically take some time and look through the folks under them. It's a good idea to do that. I wish I could spend more time doing that, but just looking through those who work in your department, looking at their record keeping and kind of addressing anything that comes up, that the good stuff and the bad, right? Give compliments for I've stolen methods of taking information from tons of people that I've worked with over time. So you know, give compliments when those are due as well, but having others review for you as well can be helpful. Keeping original data, that's again something that if we're keeping it, we need to keep it stored in a very secure place. How long we need to keep things and those kind of things might differ depending on your jurisdiction, where you work. Specify when you obtained the data, when it was reviewed and approved. Some of this is automated for some of us. If you tag somebody as a reviewer, for example, that approval is kind of documented at the end of the documentation itself in our system. But if you work in a field where things are more handwritten, or you're passing it along, or other people review by just signing off, we should be signing and dating and doing all those things. Backing up data when necessary. We don't have our hands in kind of the electronic piece of the matter at the Department of Prisons in North Carolina, but if you're in a private practice or things like that, make sure your technology works the way it's supposed to. Back up that information. And so the don'ts, again, kind of line up really naturally with some of the things that were spoken about before. So not delaying and recording the information, not signing for other people. I don't think we're really being asked to do that, but and I hope we're not being asked to do that. But how we're documenting, not making things confusing, vague, or unreadable. If there are places that I think when I was on internship, we had to do handwritten notes, and my apologies to whomever had to read my handwritten notes. Apologies there, but some things have been automated to be electronic, and I think that's great. But if we think about the content of what we're writing, staying away from jargon and terminology that anybody outside of our field would not understand, that would be helpful. Again, like mentioned briefly before, not falsifying data, self-verifying data. I think that's kind of, for us, proofreading, and this is a little different because, like I said, this is from the pharmaceutical world. Don't block or delete errors completely when correcting them. I think we don't even have that option anymore. There was a time when we could update our notes back when I started, but they changed that, good, bad, or indifferent. But I know what I have done to kind of correct some information. So before I spoke about like omitting and not completing sentences, I'll go back and make a general admin note and refer to the prior note and complete what I didn't do. And that's when I catch it. So, but if we're kind of looking out for each other and having people review things, or even just go back and do your own audit, you can update things like that, or put in the documentation, which essentially is their chart, that this is being corrected. Don't predate or backdate. I haven't really spoken about this at all, but it's important to think about. Sometimes we'll start a note anticipating that, and for start a note, for those who don't work in the Department of Prisons in North Carolina, our electronic system, you can kind of start, we have it scheduled, and then you can start the note. Might start it before the person gets to our office, or whatever, might start to pre-fill information, and then they don't come, or they don't stay for the session, or whatever the case may be. So I really suggest trying to wait until actually the sessions after the session has started to kind of start some of that documentation. Backdating, I really, our system automatically denotes when we're completing the documentation, and things happen. There's clearly, whether it's power going down 3 and 4 times, things may be delayed, but I would really caution against, I have this paperwork on my desk from an encounter I completed last month, and going back and entering that as if it happened on that day. Try to avoid that as much as possible by documenting immediately. This one says don't dispose of documents unless explicitly told to do so. That I would not. I think often if we're just doing scratch documentation as psychologists or social workers or whatever fields we're in, it's not really a problem to shred that little scratch paper and scratch notes that you keep for yourself. Now, when it comes down to records from testing, for example, we should be keeping those. It should be kept somewhere, but they should not be scanned into Hero. So just wanted to clarify that. I know that probably means nothing to folks who are not a part of our system, but for those who are, let's just make that clear. So definitely check this out on your own at your leisure. I just thought it was interesting to see what other fields are saying about their documentation and how they look at the do's and don'ts of good documentation. So, as mentioned in the beginning, we kind of want to separate or distinguish between requirement, preference, and error, right? So what are the requirements? I think of all the things that have been said, a really basic and kind of duh moment would be to complete documentation, right? Like make sure that it's actually done. Not avoiding doing the documentation at all, kind of like, okay, I saw 10 people today, I only documented, God bless you if you're seeing 10 people a day, and I can imagine it might be hard to get documentation done. But you can try to get that documentation completed. We want to have some record of it having been done, or at least started for those who can't finish it necessarily in that day per se, but it's in a reasonable amount of time, complete the documentation. We actually want it completed, right? We want to make sure that we're assessing for risk in any encounter and that that's documented in that note or report, whatever it is. We want to be sure that we're evaluating mental status. If the person's sitting in front of us and it's that type of contact, then we want to evaluate mental status. I will make a note for, again, sorry, I keep referring to those of us in the system, but I think it applies to everyone in some way, shape, or form. And so I'll try to make it kind of broaden, but there are different types of contacts that we may have with the client population that don't require all of this. And that might be something, and I'll just give the example for those of us in the symptoms, like an outpatient support contact. So it's literally just a support contact, might be a brief, this person asked that, give this message to so-and-so, and you did that. I don't need to assess for their mental status when they're just asking me to pass on a message to someone, or if they're just asking a question. But I do want to document that I had that conversation with that person, because it's a bad idea in the prison system in particular to have conversations with offenders and for them to be able to say that that contact happened and there's no record of it. But it's not necessarily a therapeutic or a contact requiring mental status and risk assessment and all that. It's like, hey, Dr. Bowman, can you tell, so-and-so that I need to see them this week? Yeah, I can write that really quick and I'll let them know and write that down real quick, right? Like put it in the chart so that it's there. Or they might have questions about how come my medication didn't come, and I might explain, you know what, you need to put in a request for this, that, and the third. The fact that that conversation occurred is in there, but I'm not evaluating mental status and all of that. I would encourage folks, if you work in the community or in other areas, if a client calls or stops you somewhere or something, that you do document that information. I think it's always best to be safe than sorry. Especially if you provide information and then that can come back up at some other time. It's like, there's no record that this happened. And if you're anything like me, my memory is not awesome anymore. So if I don't document it, and you hear this all the time, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. Truly, that is the case. So I do encourage folks to have some type of documentation down. But again, if these are more therapeutic, report writing, assessments, you want to finish a document, you want to assess for risk, you want to evaluate mental status, include discussion of limits of confidentiality and consent, especially if that's your first contact with that individual. Don't just presume that previous discussions suffice. Make sure that you have that conversation with that individual and document that you had it. Provide clear support for your conclusion. So whatever you're saying, you're concluding, support for that should be apparent in that document, and then make sure that that document is secure. I think that those are some basic requirements that I could pull from the full presentation and say, these are the things that we have to do, right? Now, in terms of preference, so what can kind of fall into that gray area of do it like this or like that. Somebody might tell you to do it like this, and it's not necessarily the way that you need to do it for the rest of your life, or this supervisor might want it this way and this person might want it that way. I think that would be the method of documentation. That might have to do with the availability. If you work someplace where you don't have access to a computer all the time, you're probably going to be doing a lot of handwritten stuff, or maybe there's other ways of documenting that just aren't consistent across locations. You may work in different facilities for those of us in the prison system, and you might have an office at one place and the other place is catch as catch as catch can, right? Sit down where you can sit down and get the notes done when you can get them. So you might be writing more at one place than you would at another. So that's, I think, more of a preferential thing, but just making sure that we have things stored. If you're working in the community, there might be, you might just be keeping Word documents. I don't know what's happening in community work much anymore, but I know personally, I kind of have a more secure method on using kind of drives and putting security around it. I mostly do report writing in the communities at this point, not ongoing therapy sessions, but there are also free options like therapynotes.com and things like that for like storing notes for you. But if you have like your own personal thing, just make sure it's secure, password protected, that your kid can't access it if they get into your computer, those kind of things. The content, language, the tone, the style, there might be different preferences on that. Somebody might want a warmer, hand-holding kind of discussion in their therapeutic encounters, and somebody else might be really strict, straight to the point, no warmth, no narrative, just kind of like this happened, this happened, this happened, they look like this, they look like that, we talked about this, boom. And that's a preference. Document length, level of detail, inclusion of quotes, though I think it's important to have a kind of a good balance. It's something that can kind of be more based on a person's personal preference. Can also vastly differ. If I have two people that work with me, that one sees two people per day, I do probably expect a lot more detail from that person. It's not really happening in our system, right? But if that person's seeing two people per day, I expect that note's probably going to be vastly more informative to me, right, than somebody who's seeing the 10 people a day that I mentioned before. Those notes might be some of the stuff that I talked about earlier, where they look really similar to one another, not a ton of detail where I can tell the difference, but if you include something that really makes it specific to that person, that's okay. And we're kind of meeting standards and meeting needs, right? Inclusion of quotes can be preferential, but I always encourage folks to do that. Preference might be the demographic factors included. I think somebody made a comment about what they tend to include or check earlier on. I didn't get to see it. I'll go back and do that. But not everybody's going to be asking every single one of these questions, and somebody else might be like, hey, Dr. Bowman, you missed blah, 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 and blah. There's some preference to that. Over time, things may change as to what we need to include and what we don't. The type of documentation that you're doing is going to inform that as well, like mentioned before. So we think about all these things, but I think that falls into the preference category. And then the timing of documentation, I'm sure if you work in the community, you're probably not dealing with the difficulties of, a client potentially going someplace and you can no longer enter notes on that person, right? But in our system, we deal with that on a daily basis. So that's why it's really important to try and get our documentation done on the same day, completed, done deal, and not have to worry about it and deal with any potential problems coming from that. Okay. So now in terms of error, like what's completely erroneous, don't do that. Big X over it, right? Failing to document altogether. So just not documenting, the contact didn't happen. You spent X amount of time, pouring into this therapy session and there's no record of it. So it basically didn't happen. So failing to document is completely erroneous. Omitting necessary information. So like an offender says something and you feel like, oh, that was just a side comment, I don't need to include it. And it's about something that could inform self-injury risk. You need to kind of include that, not omitting it just because they didn't mean it, or I don't know what reason you would have to purposefully omit something that would be required in a record, but don't do it, right? Falsifying information, that was mentioned in the pharmaceutical GDP slide, but we shouldn't be doing that. There's nothing that we should just not purposefully. I'm pretty sure that we might put something incorrect by mistake, and that's different. That has to do more so with our, checking things or proofreading and maybe moving too quickly. I have been known to, I think I only did this once, but I remember at one point I put the wrong offender name in the wrong chart. Like I was horrified when that was pointed out to me, but it was pointed out to me. So, but purposefully falsifying information, absolutely not. And we don't want to include any biased or discriminatory comments or conclusions based on personal rather than professional opinion. So those are the absolute do nots, right? And so some things to think about, we want to collect the client information that we need, organize our findings into a high quality report or document, progress note, whatever you fill in that blank. Find the most precise terms to express your findings, develop appropriate diagnoses, treatment plans, and recommendations. Always respect the client, understand and remember the limits of your competence, and don't go beyond your data. I think that's a really good thought process to keep and something to return to and revisit in our mind when we're considering our documentation. When we adopt good documentation procedures, the time needed to accurately chart a case decreases. So if you kind of have these things in mind and develop some good habits, it's not going to take as much time or require as much initial thought. But as you're developing that process, or maybe trying to revamp it, that might take a little bit more time, but that work that you do on the front end is going to create a much easier go of things later on. And like that statement, once you establish a rhythm and habit of quickly and efficiently maintaining your files, it will no longer have to take up more time than is warranted. So in conclusion, be curious and inquisitive, not only in your discussions with the client, but like even into yourself. Like, why am I doing that? Ask yourself why you're doing what you're doing. Consider the 5 W's and H. So who, what, when, where, why, and how. Develop your techniques and strategies while documenting carefully and thoughtfully. And have ethical explanations and rationales for your documentation methods. And that's, I believe, some of the content that I have. Oh, Bob, I can't hear you if you're.
Sorry about that. I make the mistake that more than once about not unmuting. That was excellent, Dr. Bowman. Thank you so much. That was very thorough and informative with a lot of useful tips and reminders for us. There aren't any questions at this point. I'm going to give folks another minute to put any questions in the Q&A feature, if you would. I will make a couple comments. I just now sent the survey and CE link to folks. And I'm also here going to include the link to your slides. Thank you again for making those available to everyone. So both of those are now going through the chat feature for folks, so please utilize those. As I said, I don't see any questions. However, there was a comment and suggestion that came in earlier in the presentation toward the beginning when you were talking about intakes and initial encounters. And a attendee wrote, I also include attempt for release of information so we can request previous mental health records that require release.
Absolutely. I tend to try to do that when I can recall, but that's a very good practice. It also helps weed out those folks who kind of come in and say, oh, I was diagnosed with this, that, and the third, and the doctors prescribed me this, this, and that. And they have this laundry list of things that they want because they've had this, this, and that diagnosis. And you ask them for their records and they're like, oh, no. And they can't sign one. But when they do, I've often gotten back some really good information as well. So that is a great idea. And thank you for sharing that, because I absolutely recommend asking for that release of information from anywhere that they've been in the community prior to us or prior prison systems. That has been really helpful in furthering along treatment as well.
Yeah, indeed. And it covers this. Even if you don't receive the records, I think that's good practice because it shows that we made an attempt to get important data, for the assessment or what have you. Excellent. There is a question that came in here. If a clinician speaks with a family member, should there be documentation of the encounter?
I have documented it merely because I definitely want it in the chart. Now, the details that you include in that, I think that's debatable. And I would definitely welcome anybody who's been in the system longer to kind of chime in with a response to that. But I have Absolutely. Included like the family member's name, contact information, and a little brief paragraph about what was discussed. Because again, like I said before, people can move in a flash, I can blink and somebody can be transferred. I want number one to have that information in the chart so that the next clinician can know that this is a valid person that called. And I often will also kind of get a sense if the client is functional enough to provide it. Is that a person that they want us speaking to? So we should always have that release. I'd probably get a release of information to talk to that person. The same, our forms are the same in that we can just kind of change a couple of things and put like discussion with family as the reason for contact. And I've done that where I would not talk to a family member. They were calling me for weeks and weeks, and I did not call until the person stabilized and I was able to get their release to talk to the mother, and then got a ton of information, which was fabulous, and documented that for whomever needs to work with that client in the future.
Yeah, excellent. Someone had made that comment about getting a release of information. There's another question. Any thought on the MSE checklist? I find that staff really like it, but sometimes third party views this as a checklist / template. Do you have any thoughts about it?
So I don't use the checklist like the one that I put in the slide, which I think is useful for us, like maybe to use personally to make sure that we get all the information. But the way that I have a text string that consistently all of my clients, I'm answering the questions in those ways, even though I might not be gathering the information in the same way for each client. I know that I'm checking off those boxes in my head. It's really just, it's not a checklist in that way. It's like I guess a kind of recorded kind of, I'm going over these items, I'm making sure to ask these questions, and I'm filling in these blanks in these areas. So it's kind of like a checklist, but it's not going into the chart itself. The sentence string is what's going in there that looks more like I think what third-party reviewers prefer to see, which is something that looks like actual interaction with the person, which it should be, and not just kind of like a checklist to get through.
Great. A lot of comments and things are coming in. Let me scan these real quick. Several people are asking about access to the slides. I do have the link in there that you can follow. Scroll up in the chat feature and you should see that and go to the slides. If for some reason you can't access it, you can email me and I can send you the slides by a different means. Yeah, some people, it doesn't allow them to access it that way. So just contact me directly.
And I might need to change the permissions. I might need to change the permissions so that anybody with the link can view it. So I will make sure to do that. I thought I did that, but I'll double check. So you might be able to take the link and check it later. It might work.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Bowman. I'm skimming these here because a lot of stuff have come in. A lot of comments are about how much they appreciate this talk, great presentation, and so forth. I think those are all the questions. I hope I didn't miss anyone's question, but I think we covered it. Thank you again, Dr. Bowman. This was fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the time out to do this. And I hope everyone enjoyed today's presentation, and be on the lookout for our future webinars coming up. Everyone have a fabulous day.